Paul received his doctorate from the University of Toronto before joining the English department at the University of Richmond, and after a brief time there, the Queen's English department, where he was a distinguished member and later head of department. He returned to our department as Canada Research Chair in Early Modern Literature and Culture. He recently completed a term as department chair here. Paul is best known in academic circles as a Miltonist. His exemplary scholarship has won him every award in his field. He served as president of the Milton Society, and his many honors include Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Milton Society and from the Canadian Society for Renaissance Studies. One of the things that's most impressed me about Paul is his range of interests. Despite a publishing history in Milton studies that would have exhausted lesser mortals, he's also produced important studies of not only other major early modern writers like Shakespeare, Spenser, and Donne, but also John Bunyan, Winston Churchill, and as we'll hear today, Daniel Defoe. I can't end without mentioning his outstanding teaching record, a record which has earned him a host of awards, including the U of T's President's Award. He was a most appropriate winner of the Northrop Frye Award for teaching and research, an award reserved for all-rounders like Paul. His topic today is Robinson Crusoe and the Slave Trade, a treatise against adventure. Please join me in welcoming Paul Stevens.
Just give me a second to get used to this paraphernalia. That's amazing. It's all right. So this is okay. Is it okay, Michael? There you go. Yep. It's like being in the movies. You know, it's ridiculous. You're like Lorna. Anyway, okay. So the purpose of this talk is really is Robinson Crusoe and what Robinson Crusoe has to tell us about the slave trade. I first started reading Robinson Crusoe. It was one of the first books I ever read, and I was about 11 when I started it. And in those days in Britain, you did the 11 plus exam, so I can remember reading it as I was doing the 11 plus. And what I loved about Robinson Crusoe was the idea that you were on this island and you were alone on this island, and it was your island, and you could do with it what you wanted. This was the kid's perspective. You could build this domain. Nobody was going to get in your face. Well, there was cannibals, but it was pretty cool. And it was the kind of thing that we did as kids anyway, because when we were playing, we were off building our domains. So there was something really powerful about this novel, and extraordinary in a way that it could attract a kid of 11. And at the same time, 100 years later, I'm teaching it, and it still seems to be incredibly absorbing. I didn't actually start teaching it until 2 years ago. And almost inevitably, the course that I was teaching it on was one which was focused on colonialism and empire. So almost inevitably, we started to talk about slavery. The extraordinary thing about Robinson Crusoe is that it's hard to believe. I mean, this is just thinking as a reader of novels, that a novel that is so intelligent and so compelling could be anything but opposed to slavery. And the instincts that you have push you towards that, to start thinking in those terms. And there's all kinds of things in the novel which encourage you to think in that way, that this really must be, in some way, a critique of slavery. And so you have things, all kinds of evidence, like the relationship between Crusoe and Friday, and the kind of relativism that comes out because you get Friday's response to Christianity, to religion. And it's that sense of, and there's also this wonderful way in which Crusoe starts thinking about the way that cannibals themselves, I wouldn't say respect, but there's a sense that you have to think about the way they understand what they're doing. And according to their own lights, they may be right. So this must be a text that is in some way opposed to slavery. Tom Keemer's wonderful introduction, if you got a chance to read it, Tom Keemer's wonderful introduction to the novel in the Oxford Classics series encourages you to start thinking in these ways too, although Tom, being the brilliant scholar that he is incredibly judicious. So what this paper is about is really me trying to figure out what exactly is going on in this novel in relation to slavery. The paper takes about 45 minutes to read. So if you feel like nodding off, please do. If you get bored, you know. Okay. And so it takes about 45 minutes. And there are really 6 moves involved. And the first move is to talk about not the Atlantic slave trade, or the one that we usually think of as the slave trade, but the Arab slave trade, and then to see how it's connected. The second move is to talk about technology. The third move is to talk about the failure of technology and the kind of religious perspective it allows somebody like Crusoe. The fourth move is to look much more closely at the nature of that perspective, and in particular, Crusoe's idealization of a thing called thrift. And that's the heart of the paper. What does he mean by thrift? The next part is simply to talk about a pamphlet that he wrote about trade in Africa in 1711. And the last move, to bring it to a conclusion, is to say something about Quakers in Barbados. Okay. In July 1627, a few years after the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, slave traders ranging along the African seaboard of what came to be known as the Old World landed at an unusually remote island. They murdered 30 to 40 local people and carried off another 242 into captivity. From other settlements further north along the mainland, they abducted another 140 or so men, women, and children. These slavers were not Christians, but Muslims, many of them converts or renegades from Algiers and Salé. And the people they enslaved were Icelanders. The incursion is famous in Icelandic history as what's called the Turkish raid, but only recently has it become an object of interest elsewhere. The principal settlement the slavers attacked was at Jaime in the Westman Islands, and the raids were part of a great series of Arab incursions into Western Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The slavers were often known as Barbary pirates because they proceeded from the Barbary or Berber coast of North Africa, from Morocco and the Ottoman regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Most of their acts of violence took the form of high seas assaults on shipping, but a surprisingly large number involved raids on coastal villages as disparate as Terceros in northern Spain, or Looe in Cornwall, or Baltimore in Ireland. Robert Davis records over 80 coastal invasions between 1563 and 75, including one that comes close to home for me, the capture of Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel, which enabled slavers to terrorize the West Country for a decade. These incursions, both at sea and on land, did not finally end until the beginning of the 19th century and the colonization of North Africa by France and other European powers. According to Davis, between 1530 and 1780, there were almost 1 million, and quite possibly as many as 1.25 million white European Christians enslaved by the Muslims of the Barbary Coast. The impact of the Barbary slave trade on 17th century England was considerable. Not only was there a boom in the publication of captivity narratives and a resurgence in the staging of Turk plays, but the needs of the Royal Navy became a priority, and Charles I's use of the raids as a pretext for his illegal extension of ship money to England's inland counties did much to precipitate the Civil War. For most English people before the Civil War, what slavery meant was the Arab slave trade, not the Atlantic slave trade. Since it was not the custom of Muslim slavers on Corso to buy slaves, their principal weapon was terror. At Jaime, Pastor Oliver Ailson, as he remembers it, the slavers killed anyone who offered the slightest resistance. And according to another victim, Gudimar Halson, they burnt the buildings, tortured and killed many people. They took away all the captives they could, like cruel hunting hounds. According to the official report, when the Icelanders could not move as fast as the Moors wished, the slavers beat them to death and left them lying behind. So bloodthirsty were they that they turned back to hack and strike the dead for the sick pleasure of it. The Icelanders refer to the slavers as Moors or Turks, but they seem surprised that the ethnicity of the slavers was so diverse, often coming from Germany, Denmark, Holland, and England. For Ailson and the other Icelanders, race in particular never appears to be an explanatory category. The slavers were simply bad or godless men. It is important to emphasize that the breakout of the Arab or Turkish slave trade into the North Atlantic is almost entirely coincidental with the dramatic escalation of the European slave trade further south along the west coast of Africa. The two moments are not unrelated, and one of the many remarkable features of Daniel Defoe's 1719 novel Robinson Crusoe is the clarity with which it brings their relationship into focus. In the course of his adventures, Crusoe is enslaved by Arabs precisely as he seeks to enslave Africans. What enabled both these moments of expansion in human trafficking the critical link between them was technology. And so while my general aim in this talk is to recontextualize these developments in order to understand why there was so little articulate opposition in 17th century Europe to the resurgence of the slave trade, my immediate aim is to understand how, in the specific case of Robinson Crusoe, the relationship between technology and contingency contributes to this moral failure. My argument falls into two parts. The first focuses on technology and the way its limitations or failures precipitate in Crusoe a spiritual awakening or renewed religious perspective. And the second on the way this new religious perspective or moment of grace somewhat surprisingly actually serves to protect the slave trade. It does so because it shifts attention from the morality of slavery itself to a subsidiary moral debate on the rival claims of thrift as opposed to adventure in the pursuit of a good life. That is, a life that is both virtuous and commercially successful. Here in Defoe's version of Amazing Grace, revelation doesn't awaken conscience so much as deaden it. The slave trade was first formally abolished in England not in 1807, but many centuries before in 1102 by Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury at the Council of Westminster. Anselm, the King Henry I's primate, decreed, quote, "Let no one dare hereafter to engage in the infamous business prevalent in England of selling men like animals." Although the primary purpose of this decree may well have been simply the suppression of the Irish slave trade, that is, selling people into slaves into Ireland, its critical importance is that it makes the possibility of a more pronounced 17th century rejection of slavery, of chattel slavery, anything but anachronistic. The medieval Irish slave trade had its principal base, somewhat ironically, in Bristol, where those considered enslavable were not Africans or members of any other non-European people, but the English themselves. All kinds of poor English people, masterless men, propertyless and abused women were abducted, says Robert Bartlett, chained together and put on the market. The girls among them raped before they were sold. Over the course of the century following Anselm's decree, chattel slavery, largely for economic reasons, disappeared from England, and the English routinely came to think of themselves as, by definition, freeborn. In 1569, for instance, in the frequently cited case of Cartwright, slavery in England was categorically declared illegal, England being, quote, "too pure an air for slaves to breathe in." The question at the heart of this paper is then, how did the English, a people who grew up in the traditions of Anselm, and in a country where chattel slavery, as opposed to villanage or indentured servitude, had been both forbidden by the church and never legalized by the state, adapt to and rationalize the 17th century rehabilitation of chattel slavery? How in 1677, for instance, did England's Solicitor General persuade himself that enslaved Africans, quote, ought to be considered goods and commodities within the acts of trade and navigation? Just to be specific, how did a people newly familiar with the horror of their own compatriots being enslaved by Muslim entrepreneurs occlude the patent injustice of their own Atlantic slave trade? Part of the answer, obviously, has to do with the indifference induced by distance and the remoteness of Africa's Guinea coast. Part, equally obviously, has to do with the way that race as an ethnic category had become less inchoate and increasingly reified over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. So much so that by 1719, when refracted through the hardening distinction between civility and savagery, some races clearly had come to be seen as more enslavable than others. But neither of these considerations fully explains the particular way Robinson Crusoe provides its own more complex answer to the question. That is, neither explains the very peculiar way the novel helps Defoe's readers maintain their indifference to the injustice of the slave trade. In order to unravel this complex, let me first say something about technology. Much earlier, over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, sea travel among the Atlantic-facing nations of Western Europe underwent a technological revolution. First the Portuguese and Spanish, then the English, French, and Dutch, as Paul Kennedy explains, made a series of, quote, crucial advances in naval shipbuilding, navigation, and weaponry. It was these sometimes quite simple technological advances that in combination made the global expansion of Europe and the eventual industrialization of the slave trade possible. By the beginning of the 17th century, much of this technology had been transferred to the Barbary polities of North Africa, Muslim states whose seamen had been plying their slaving trade in the Mediterranean for generations. The agents of this transference were renegade European privateers, zealous converts like the Dutchman Murat Reis, originally known as Jan Jansen, the captain who inspired the extraordinarily hazardous 2,000-mile voyage to Iceland. It goes without saying that the primary purpose of technology, techne or know-how, the knowledge of how to make things, the calculation and experimentation that produces such knowledge, and then the further advances that such carefully recorded knowledge and its instruments enable, is human agency. The empowerment not only by overcoming particular difficulties, but by reducing risk or contingency in general. That is, by reducing what von Clausewitz calls friction. In this context, the cultural importance of Robinson Crusoe is immense. Not only does the novel celebrate the emergence of modern individualism, but more importantly, it idealizes the kind of calculation, craft, and record keeping by which the individual reduces Clausewitz's friction, and in so doing asserts the West's defining virtue, its wealth-producing mastery of knowledge, its wealth-producing mastery of technology. In Karl Marx's Capital, Crusoe is singled out not only as the archetype. Marx's Capital begins with Robinson Crusoe. In Karl Marx's Capital, Crusoe is singled out not only as the archetype of the independent man, but much more specifically as the quintessential bookkeeping tradesman and technician who learns by experience and once shipwrecked on a desert island, immediately starts calculating. Quote, having saved a watch, ledger, ink, and a pen from the shipwreck, says Marx, he soon begins, like a true-born Englishman, to keep a set of books. His stockbook contains a catalog of the useful objects he possesses, of the various operations necessary for their production, and finally, of the labor time that specific quantities of these products have on average cost him. For Marx, it would come as no surprise that not even Milton, Defoe's bourgeois precursor and very much a true-born Englishman, could imagine humankind's original unfallen state without technology. In Milton's Paradise, for instance, although Eve may look like an artless wood nymph light, she is in fact much more like Crusoe than one might expect. She is passionate about her work. She hates the idea that supper should come, quote, unearned, and sets about her gardening task with resolution and, quote, such gardening tools as art yet rude, guiltless of fire had formed or angels brought. In a recent book on captives, Linda Colley continues Marx's emphasis on technology. Quote, by becoming an architect, carpenter, knife grinder, astronomer, baker, shipwright, potter, saddler, farmer, tailor, and even an umbrella maker, the shipwrecked Crusoe, she says, subdues his unpromising environment and renders it fruitful. Indeed, there are moments of such intense, albeit guarded pleasure in this process that Crusoe feels as though he has repaired the ruin of our first parents and regained paradise. As he increasingly exerts his methodical bookkeeping and technologically adept authority over the island, for instance, he discovers what Milton would call a happy rural seat of various view. That is, in the middle of the island, he discovers this garden-like place, the locus aminus, a, quote, delicious vale which with a little spring of fresh water appeared so green, so flourishing, everything being in a constant verdure or flourish of spring, that it looked like a planted garden. Indeed, that it looked like another Eden. Here, in what he imagines as his country seat, there are moments when he feels the joy of an agency that employs absolute dominion or full freedom. Quote, "To think this was all my own," he says, "that I was king and lord of all this country indefeasibly and had a right of possession, and if I could convey it, I might have it in inheritance as completely as any lord of a manor in England." This is what was attracting the little boy, the 11-year-old boy reading this stuff. In this reverie, he comes close to the heart of the colonial imperative, sovereignty and the recreation of the garden in the wilderness. But the vision is deeply ironic, illusory, or anamorphic, because when seen from another perspective, this particular Eden is hell. The island remains a prison, and as Colley emphasizes, he is still unfree, a captive who, despite his best efforts, cannot escape the island. What makes Defoe's novel so interesting, then, is that while it celebrates technology and its triumphs, it also insists on technology's limitations and the insights its unpredictable failures allow. That is, on their affordances. These affordances are critically important in the novel's rhetorical strategy, because it is in them that Defoe's hero appears to recognize the awful power of God's freedom, that is, providence, or the commanding presence of grace in the world. Robinson Crusoe announces itself over and over again as a spiritual awakening or autobiography. And the primary symbol of human bondage it reveals, of technology's limitations and its affordances, is the unpredictable power of the sea. As Defoe makes clear in an early poem in 1706, the masterly genius of Milton was an abiding influence. And the full horror of being imprisoned or being confronted by hell's boundaries, what Milton describes as a, quote, "dark, illimitable ocean without bound, without dimension, where length, breadth, and height, and time and place are lost," is reproduced almost word for word in Crusoe's fear of the same, quote, "vast ocean, where, to be sure, there was no shore, no mainland or island, for 1,000 leagues at least." In other words, Defoe uses Milton's oceanic hell as a means of conveying the full horror of Crusoe's state of bondage. While technology assures Crusoe of his agency and independence, it alone cannot get him off the island. It is always circumscribed, overshadowed by chance, by contingencies over which he has no control. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean. This is the point where he builds a boat and he digs a canal to get the boat to the sea. And the idea is to circumnavigate the island. He gets the boat there and he gets the boat out into the water. And then all of a sudden the boat is caught in a current, and none of the techniques, none of the ability that he has can control this current. And it looks, and it's a magnificent passage. You're just completely caught up with it. And then all of a sudden, he realizes in the text, this is the power of God. And at the moment that he realizes it, he suddenly feels a breath of wind. And of course, it's the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God and that breath of wind lifts him out of the current, and he's able to return to land. The terrifying realism of the novel's form in this, as it's detailed and material actuality masks the presence of the text's biblical metaphors, and so roots its religious content in the documentary grain of immediate experience. Religion here doesn't seem gratuitous, either recreational, as Marx claims, or stilted and unemotional, as James Joyce complains about the novel. Defoe grew up as a dissenter who lived and breathed the Pauline argument of grace. He knew its power, and the religious intensity of the passage seems real, heartfelt, and no matter how unreliable a narrator Crusoe is, compelling in its authenticity. But this is part of the danger of the novel. As Crusoe's climactic shipwreck insists on the precariousness of human technique, it gains in spiritual authority by rehearsing the central metaphors of God's agency in the books of Jonah and Job. Before Crusoe is vomited out like Jonah-like on the shore, he is swallowed by the sea, which appears in all its mountainous strength like Leviathan, the sea beast who makes the deep to boil and whose power has no equal. In Scripture, as Yahweh explains to Job, Leviathan is the power and glory of God in all its terror, specifically as it's seen from the perspective of his enemies, that is, of those who oppose his will. It cannot be contended with. Only God himself has the skill or techne to draw Leviathan out with an hook. It is an image that haunts the Western imagination. You could write a history of Western literature just through this image, not least in modernity's arrogation of God's freedom, in Hobbes' statism, from Hobbes' statism to Melville's Ahab, or Cormac McCarthy in Blood Meridian's Judge Holden. With this in mind, if we return to the Barbary slavers on Iceland, then it seems no accident that the enslaved Icelandic leader, Pastor Ailson, would see the Arab slavers as a prosthetic arm of the sea and should seek refuge in the resignation of Job. I have to say with Job, what is my strength that I should hope? The strength of the slavers emerging from the sea is like that of Leviathan, and it is God's will that we should surrender ourselves to his mercy. As the slavers epitomize the perils of the sea, so they are understood as a manifestation of God's power. Similarly, Crusoe is explicit in identifying the continued storms that thwart his pursuit of agency with slavery worse than Turkish. He collapses the two ideas, slavery and the storms of the sea. They're both functions of God's will. His capture by an Arab slaving ship out of Saleh is quite explicitly understood as the work of God. In the failure of his own ship's formidable technology, its guns and their broadsides, he sees the hand of heaven. From merchant to miserable slave, he says, I was undone without redemption. Enslavement by the Moors is no different from imprisonment on the island. It is, quote, without redemption. Both Crusoe and Pastor Ailson faithfully accept their fate. But when their responses are compared, they are both alike and completely unalike. They are alike in that for all their misery as slaves and for all the revolutionary social potential in Pauline Christianity's insistence that in Christ there is, quote, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither of them ever explicitly questions the institution of slavery itself. More importantly, they are unalike in that if Ailson's faith induces a kind of fatalism, Crusoe's grace, his newly revealed sense of God's freedom, only reveals the need to recalibrate his original behavior. The morality of slavery itself remains unexamined as Crusoe struggles to understand what he considers the far more pressing relationship between moderation and thrift on the one hand, moderation and thrift, and risk and adventure on the other. That's the critical opposition. As he does this, it becomes increasingly evident that despite his apparent friendship with his subjects, Zuri and Friday, they are simply instruments of thrift. Unlike Ailson, Crusoe is anything but passive, and on capture immediately begins planning his escape. He longs to return to his adventuring ways, and although the treatment he receives in Salé is not as dreadful as I first apprehended, he aches to leave this horrid place. Crusoe's claim that he does so by an exquisite management is something of a stretch. Even if the calculating technocrat is irrepressible, his plans soon fall apart. Lost off the coast of Guinea with his faithful companion Zuri, a young Morisco from Spain, he is redeemed by a contingency, a fortuitous encounter with a friendly Portuguese ship on its way to Brazil. Crusoe is once again shown the hand of Providence. The Portuguese captain's claim to what appears to be an inexhaustible but judicious charity is, however, confounded by the fate of Zuri. The story of Zuri is critically important. Crusoe and Zuri become friends. And again, what is so deceptive about this novel is the way that the biblical allusions are under the surface all the time. The relationship is imagined as that between Ruth and Naomi. But Crusoe betrays him and immediately sells Zuri into slavery. And the same argument can be made about Friday, is that for all Friday's faithfulness, he is principally a piece of utility. The function of Friday is, and he says it quite, his education is so that he will be able to help me with these jobs. It's entirely utilitarian. And what is devastating at the end of the novel is that after the most important thing is the way that Friday helps Crusoe in his 3 climactic battles at the end of the novel. And after those battles, Friday simply disappears. There's no mention of him. But card-carrying Defoe specialists will say, but he reappears in the sequel, The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. It doesn't matter. The impact of the novel itself is hard to get around. The critical trick, or the point where we come to the heart of the opposition to slavery is in Crusoe's 3rd climactic voyage. That's the voyage that gets him shipwrecked. And it's in this voyage that he most explicitly represents himself as a slaver, an independent trader who gets shipwrecked and is redeemed. The novel seems to offer a critique of the slave trade. The ill-fated slaving voyage, which ends in Crusoe's own enslavement on the island, begins with an allusion to Milton's own account of original sin. The ill-fated slaving voyage, which ends in Crusoe's own enslavement on the island, begins fairly predictably with Defoe, with an allusion to Milton. Crusoe embarks in, quote, that evil hour, just as Eve reaches for the fatal fruit in an equally, quote, evil hour. But as one of Defoe's earliest and most astute readers, this is writing a year after the book came out, Charles Gildon, pointed out, having set up the moral fable, Defoe does not pursue it. At no point does Crusoe find, quote, any check of conscience, says Gildon, in that infamous trade of buying and selling men for slaves. This is a failure, he feels, because one would have expected him to have attributed his shipwreck to this very cause, and it's certainly set up that way. Gildon is right, for Crusoe himself makes it clear that the true nature of his original sin and that's the word he uses, original sin, as God's grace reveals it to him, lies not in the pursuit of slavery, but in that of adventure. Before he is blessed with the arrival of Crusoe, the arrival of Friday, Crusoe realizes that his youthful opposition to his father's advocacy of moderation, thrift, or, quote, confined desires was, as I may call it, my original sin. His father sees this opposition as one between those who aim to raise their fortunes by application and industry on the one hand, and those who go, quote, abroad upon adventures on the other. The latter, he insists, are prone to, quote, vicious living, luxury, and extravagances. This opposition is repeated over and again, but most importantly in Crusoe's overreaching willingness to leave his slave plantation in Brazil and embrace hazard. What business had I, he berates himself, to leave a settled fortune, a well-stocked plantation, improving and increasing, to turn supercargo to Guinea, to fetch Africans when patience and time would have so increased our stock of slaves at home that we could have bought them at our own front door from those whose business it was to fetch them. Though it may have cost us a little more, that price was by no means worth saving at so great a hazard. Here, as Crusoe agonizes over the opposition between gradual improvement, growth, or thrift on the one hand, and high-risk surplus seeking profit on the other, there is no time to reflect on the morality of the slave trade itself. As he struggles with the moral difference between thrift and adventure, he inadvertently reverses the argument of popular texts like Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. At the center of the Merchant of Venice is the opposition between thrift and adventure. In that highly influential play, set more than a little ironically in one of the key centers of the Mediterranean slave trade, Shylock's argument for moderation in business. In that highly influential play, set more than a little ironically in one of the key centers of the Mediterranean slave trade, Shylock's argument for moderation in business, his appeal to the success of careful calculation in the story of Jacob and Laban, is excoriated by the real eponymous merchant of Venice, Antonio. For Shylock, Jacob's ingenious use of techne, that's peeled poles to shape the poles, which were striped, okay, to shape the imagination of ewes as they breed and so produce party-colored lambs, is a model of application and industry, of technological calculation. This was a way to thrive, and he was blessed, for thrift is a blessing. That is an act of grace. That's Shylock. For Antonio, Jacob's stratagem is certainly an act of grace, but has nothing to do with Shylock's advocacy of interest, usury, or even thrift. This was a venture, sir, a thing not in Jacob's power to bring to pass, but swayed and fashioned by the hand of heaven. In Defoe's novel, Crusoe begins his career with Antonio's ready acceptance of hazard. His first adventure to Africa yields a profit of 300% in trading gold. An astonishing reward for his faith in high-risk possibilities, an extraordinary surplus or assurance of things hoped for. But the revelation afforded by Providence, the disastrous frictions of adventure, encouraged Crusoe to turn from Antonio to Shylock. Indeed, his experience on the island leads him to question the value of surplus altogether, in a way that does much to inspire Marx's notion of primitive communism, Commodities on the island have no exchange value at all, only use value. Surplus, even, quote, a drawer full of diamonds, is quite literally useless. Although once back in the world, Crusoe recovers his interest in profit pretty soon. On the island, he is chastened, and thrift has modified adventure. If Antonio deconstructs the opposition between thrift and adventure, Crusoe reconstructs it with a vengeance. The critical point is that in Crusoe's spiritual autobiography, because the focus of the absorbing drama is the struggle between thrift and adventure, the real locus of grace, the morality of slavery, as Gilden complained, gets passed over. It gets forgotten. In the early 18th century, publishing, the world of censorship and subterfuge, it may well be, in that world, it may well be that there is a distinction to be drawn between Crusoe and his cunning author, Daniel Defoe, and that the novel is in fact a critique of Crusoe's hypocrisy rather than evidence of Defoe's moral blindness. In terms of impact, however, in terms of how Robinson Crusoe was read in the world, that is, how the novel's cultural work occluded violence and injustice in the Atlantic slave trade. Such careful distinctions don't really matter. But even if they did, Defoe and Crusoe are not so easily separated. Most importantly, such separation is confounded by the real advocacy work Defoe pursues in his own voice on behalf of the slave trade. In particular, his 1711 essay upon the trade to Africa. For there, this same telltale pattern of thrift versus adventure repeats itself in the novelist's overt defense of England's most infamous slaving corporation, the Royal African Company. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. All right. Your fault, not mine. Okay. I just want to say something about this pamphlet, okay, and then I want to turn to the Quakers. Threatened with insolvency, the company, which had been granted a monopoly to trade in Africa by Charles II in 1672. 1672 is the key date. It's when the slave trade for England really begins. And it doesn't really, people talk about Hawkins in the 16th century. It's an aberration. The slave trade really begins after the Restoration, although it doesn't mean that, that Cromwell is not involved in it. The company had been granted a monopoly to trade into Africa by Charles II in 1672. And it came under concerted public attack, principally from sugar planters, English manufacturers, and interloping merchants and slave traders in the reigns of William III and Queen Anne. It could not provide the volume of slaves that the sugar industry in Barbados in particular needed. During the period of 1709 to 13, Defoe is consistent in his defense of the company. He published two tracts in 1711, the 1711 essay and the 1713 brief account of African trade. At the same time, he routinely kept his readers informed of the company's affairs in his newspaper, The Review. In the 1711 essay, the company is represented as a model of exquisite management, thrift, and well-regulated profits. Consider, says Defoe, what the company in its short history has achieved. That is, how many English manufactures it has exported, how many Africans it has sent to the English colonies in the West Indies, how many thousands ounces of gold it has brought into England, and so on and so on. All for the mutual benefit of both Africa and England, for the growth of the country there and the necessity of ours here. The cause of the company's problems, Defoe insists, is not the company's careful management, but the irresponsible adventuring of independent traders, interlopers, Crusoes, and their open invasion of the company's lawful privileges. The irony is that Crusoe is one of the interlopers, the private traders that he's writing about, that he's writing against here. An adventurer. The cause of the company's problems, Defoe insists, is not the company's careful management, but is these people. The adventurers, as they appear there, have used, quote, subtle and unfair and dishonorable methods to carry on their trade, such as bribing the company's officers and factors abroad and so on. But just as it does in Robinson Crusoe, these adventurers, these interlopers, will only end up shipwrecked. And this is how the pamphlet continues. When the interlopers and separate traders bring their case before Parliament, these enemies of the company only meet with disaster. In the midst of their triumphs, the separate traders run themselves upon a rock which split their cause, and being shipwrecked to all intents and purposes, the Parliament broke up without being able to do anything for them. The rock which shipwrecked them was this: the want of being able to propose a real and substantial security for the preservation of the trade to the nation, without which the House could not make anything that was to be done for them. Nor was this rock an error of pilotage, but better conduct might have avoided it. It was not a rock under water or in the dark. It was open and plain. They saw it clearly. It was built upon possibilities hardly possible and split upon probabilities hardly probable. It was, in other words, built on adventure, of the kind of hazard the Merchant of Venice idealizes in the risk-taking Antonio and Bassanio. Who chooseth me must hazard all he hath. What matters is the security of trade, and the key to that is what Shylock idealizes as thrift, good order, planning, the kind of calculation that reduces friction, and that Crusoe gradually learns to practice after his spiritual awakening on the island. Defoe may be intoxicated, quote, with modern commerce, but commerce needs all that is understood by thrift. Commerce needs all that is understood by thrift. It is, as Shylock says, a blessing. The argument of the novel is circular. Its spiritual awakening doesn't mark a turning away from technology and commerce so much as a recalibration of it through moderation or thrift. In other words, the idealization of thrift is about how to make the new technology more efficient. That is, in this case, how to make slavery more efficient. Thrift, and all that Defoe means by it, is the key to the industrialization that will eventually distinguish the Atlantic from the Arab slave trade. What stands out in the 1711 essay is Defoe's complete indifference to the sufferings of the company's human cargo. My point is that in Robinson Crusoe, because Defoe makes this a story about spiritual awakening or the revelation of God's freedom, the amazing grace that transformed the life of slavers like John Newton, the composer of the hymn, is effectively co-opted and enlisted into the process of forgetting the brutal reality of the Atlantic slave trade. Defoe may be entirely sincere in his identification of grace with thrift, but it doesn't matter. The industrializing effect is the same. As the example of Ansel, and indeed the long tradition of anti-slavery legislation suggests, this is not a matter of judging the past by the values of the present. It is a matter of identifying the complex ways in which the compartmentalizing of chattel slavery that Mary Nyquist points to in her important book, Arbitrary Rule, is brought about. Defoe's preoccupation with the thrift adventure debate may have many causes, but Robert Markley's emphasis on, quote, the threat of economic insecurity that stalked the middle classes of 18th century Britain in general, and Defoe in particular, seems immediately relevant. My final point is, however, that the indifference to slavery such insecurities produce was neither necessary nor incontestable. Let me close with an example from another group of English dissenters. And the coda is simply to talk about the Quakers on Barbados. And the story of the Quakers on Barbados is fascinating. There are several hundred, there are several hundred slave owners, plantation owners on Barbados. And Hilary Beckles, who is making the big play for reparations, is the scholar, and he's a brilliant scholar, first-class scholar, is the brilliant scholar who has made the point about how important Barbados is. And it's sugar. If in the United States, it's tobacco and cotton, indigo. In the West Indies, it's sugar. And the craving for sugar and the incredible profits that are going to be made with sugar. 54 of the plantation owners on Barbados in the 1670s are Quakers. And George Fox, the founder of the movement, finds himself there in 1671-72. And he is appalled. He is overwhelmed by the treatment of the enslaved people. But he's in an incredibly difficult position. But he does make a speech to the Quakers themselves, and he appeals to Deuteronomy 15:12, where the Israelites are encouraged to on a particular occasion, to let their slaves go free. And he uses that, and he says, this will be an opportunity for grace with us. He's saying something entirely different to the regime that controls Barbados, and we can talk about that. But the interesting thing is that speech to the Quakers gets published, and in 1676 as the Family Order Compact, and it circulates among Quakers, and it leads to a convention of Quakers in Pennsylvania, in Germantown, in 1688, making the first categoric statement. And their categoric statement is that slavery must end. That's 1688. That is many years before Robinson Crusoe. Okay? The slavery must end. And the analogy they use to indicate just how terrible the practice of slavery is that by pursuing this slavery, we are no better than Turks or Arabs. Okay, that's enough for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Let's take a 10-minute break for coffee, and then we're back for questions for Paul Stevens.